Welcome to Spark and Scale, the show for higher ed leaders learning, experimenting, and evolving how we shape our future. I'm your host, Mickey Baines. Come and join me. It's time to get started. Welcome to another episode of Spark and Scale, everyone. I'm your host, Mickey Baines. Excited to be back. We have another loaded episode around AI. And if you've been listening to the last or watching the last few episodes, yes, a lot of them have been around AI, but I don't know how you do our work anymore without that being injected into the conversation. Every conversation I have, whether it's someone working on the outside looking into higher ed, someone working in higher ed, that seems to be the most constant term and phrase that we have at our fingertips that is on everyone's minds as they look at whatever is happening internally and externally in their institutions. Everyone wants to know just a bit more about what AI can do to help them and as they sort through that. So today, this is a little more tactical. I'm excited. I have Jess Bohan on with us. Jess, you are I've got to get this right, forward deployed engineer.
That's correct.
At CollegeVine. CollegeVine, if you don't know, I don't know why you don't know who CollegeVine is. You should. They're what I consider to be one of the most forward-thinking and progressive AI vendors in our space that help us really start to push the envelope of what AI can do across our entire campus operation. I knew them way back when their first voice agent was deployed on the market, and it's grown so much since that time. But today, Jess and I, we're not going to just look at all of those things. What we're going to do is talk, what does it really mean to build an agent? What does that look like? Everyone's talking about agent this, agent that. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find people saying, oh, I can build it next number of minutes and so forth. Well, what does that mean? I want to dive in a little bit into that concept. I have built an agent. I would not yet want to be the one to talk about building an agent and say it's all that easy. Jess, however, builds agents for a living. That is your job, right? And so I don't know of anyone better that's more qualified to come in and talk about that process, to think about what they can do, what does it look like to build, how hard is it? That's what we're going to dive into. So Jess, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And I bet those listening and watching, I'll give you one guess. Where do you think Jess is from? Colorado. I'm kidding. Yes. So
I haven't lost it yet. The accent is still with me.
Yes, and I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon, which I think that's awesome. So Jess, you live in the United States, you come to us from Australia. I know that's a long story and journey. Welcome to the United States. I know you've been here for a while, but welcome. I really am curious about your journey to get into AI. If you're building agents now and that is your full-time job, how did you get into AI?
Yeah, great question. So I actually come from like an economics background, econometrics specifically, and started my career in management consulting. So started in the higher education space, working with different colleges from a strategy perspective in terms of what they should be doing from like an overarching strategy, but then also from like an operating model perspective. I think as I spent a long time at a management consulting firm, I think towards the end of my time there, I was involved with the internal team that was focused on building the AI tools for that consulting firm. So actually transitioned away from kind of partner or client-facing work that we called it into the internal team to kind of focus on building those tools. So that was a couple of years ago now, but that was kind of my first transition into the AI space. And then obviously transitioned to CollegeVine a while back now, where my full-time job is actually, as you said, to build agents, which I love.
So, I have so many questions, but let's narrow them in because we have limited time and our listeners and viewers have limited time. So let's just dive in to ask this question. When we talk about building an agent, well, let's take a step back maybe and say, well, what is an agent? How is that different from a chatbot or an assistant? We've got these different terms and labels being used. As someone who builds agents, let's define clearly for the audience, what is an agent exactly?
Yeah, so there is like a spectrum, I guess you would say, of like AI autonomy. And I think to your point, I think understanding the difference is super important. I think let's start at like one end of the spectrum, like chatbots are kind of like the simplest form in terms of like, it's very much text input and kind of text output. And you can think in terms of like the higher education space, for example, you might have like just a university kind of website chatbot, where you kind of being able to train it just based on via text inputs, and then it will kind of give you text outputs. That's kind of like the simplest form, right? We kind of move up a little bit on this spectrum, and you have things like copilots. So like these are like AI systems that kind of assist you in real time, but very much scoped in kind of the system that you're operating in. So they're kind of like reactive.
When we think about the copilot, we don't mean Microsoft Copilot specifically, right? I just want to clarify, right? So I don't want people thinking, oh, well, you got to have Copilot for this. No, that's Copilot's just another term of being exactly what's described, a Copilot right by your side.
Exactly. And there are like multiple copilots that like Microsoft Copilot obviously is one of them, but there's like Git Copilot, like there's a vast majority of them. And I think they are just AI systems that assist you in real time doing what you are doing in terms of like summarizing documents, like helping with analysis. Like they are obviously super useful, but are very much focused on kind of like the tasks that you are doing within the tool that you're operating in.
Perfect.
Then I think we get to kind of agents, which is like the final, or maybe not the final, but like the other end of kind of the spectrum that we're talking about. And I think agents are fundamentally different for a couple of reasons. And I think first one is around like agents actually reason about the problem. They actually break it into steps, evaluate it, update its approach based on kind of the signals that it is ingesting. They also kind of use tools in terms of reaching out to kind of querying different databases, making API calls, like actually sending kind of external signals outside of the system that it is operating in. And then thirdly, they actually take action. So using those tools, they actually do tasks for you. So I think hopefully that gives kind of a bit of a breakdown, but you can think like chatbots kind of answer questions, a copilot will help you do your work, and then an agent will actually do your work for you.
So as a builder of an agent, what tools are you using to actually build it?
Yeah, so I think when I think about what a tool is, it's like more or less like a capability that the agent can evoke. So think about we think about agents as like team members. I am a team member as like more or less like an agent. What tools or things do I have access to be able to do my job? So it might be wanting to like query a database, or being able to like send an email or look up a student record. Like to do each of those kind of actions, like I would need some type of tool to do that. From like a CollegeVine perspective, and also what we're seeing from a market perspective, like you can think about tools via like MCPs, like Model Context Protocol, like very much initiates tools. You can think about tools via like a data layer, being able to access data. You can also think about like typical digital integrations, like APIs, browser automations. Escalation of that over the past previous months as well.
So if I wanted to build an agent, from your perspective, what are 3 things I should be doing before I start building?
Yeah, good question. And I think I'll talk to the 3 things, and then I think maybe we kind of look at kind of what's the difference between like building an agent as like yourself versus like building an agent within like a enterprise system, for example.
Perfect.
I think
yes.
In terms of kind of building an agent, like 3 things are super important. It's like, firstly is like, what is the scope of the agent? I think really clearly defining like what is the outcome that you are looking for the agent to actually solve for. And I think part of that question up front is like, is this like a deterministic workflow, and therefore is an agent actually the best? And that's a question that I would encourage people to kind of ask themselves. Or is it more of like a non-deterministic workflow, and therefore an agent that actually reasons is more appropriate for that? So I think clear kind of objective and scope is the first thing, tied back to kind of broader business objective. What is the process that you are trying to kind of optimize, or outcome you are trying to optimize for? Secondly is like the tools. And we kind of briefly spoken on that, like what is the scope of what you want the agent to be able to do? So if the business objective is to do X, what are the tools that are required to ultimately achieve that X objective? And then the third thing obviously is like the architecture that needs to sit around it. I think we spoke through kind of, there's a bunch of different capability to kind of integrate with different tools. What architecture needs to sit around it to make sure that agent has the right access, either from like a permissions perspective to data, a security perspective, like what is that overarching kind of architecture?
And if we were to take that and convert that to real time or real world, give me an example maybe of a recent agent you built for a client and how we went through those.
Yeah, absolutely. So one that comes to mind is like we built like a housing agent for one of our partner institutions that we're fortunate enough to work with. So the housing agent like had kind of 2 key objectives in terms of, One, be able to provide 24/7 support to students. So students have questions about housing kind of all the time, regardless of business hours. So that was kind of the first objective. The second objective was to streamline the way in which kind of work orders and maintenance requests were identified. So essentially, like, that was the business objective of that agent. We then identified, okay, for that agent to achieve those objectives, we needed to give it like the tools to communicate with students. So it could send emails, it could text students, it could call students, for example. We also then needed to give it the tools so it could create work orders. So when a student responds with, oh, my light is broken, for example, or this is like the door will not shut, how does the agent actually have the ability to go in and kind of create work orders? And then the third component, which is around kind of like the architecture or component of it, was around, okay, firstly, what data does it need access to be able to do that? But then importantly, how does it need to integrate with their existing processes in terms of when does it make the most sense to bring in a human in that process? Mm-hmm. When should we be escalating? Like if the microwave is on fire, perhaps the agent should escalate to someone else to kind of look at that.
Okay. That's a really good example, by the way. And I think everyone will be able to really see and envision for themselves how that works. So we talked about agents, we talked about copilots, we talked about assistants. Those, how do we know that something's agent worthy? That it's not just this simple automation, maybe just a pure chat. How do we know something is really agent worthy? What's the line in the sand to say if we cross this, that is worth an agent?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And I think there's probably a couple of things that I would talk to here. The first is really around like the level of kind of decision making that is required in that process. Is it a simple kind of like deterministic workflow in terms of, okay, A happens, then B should happen, then C should happen? Or is there actually a level of reasoning that is required or would drive a better outcome? You can think about, for example, like reaching out to students, for example. You may set up kind of a deterministic reach out to them like every single Monday, for example, with a reminder. Whereas like an agent would actually then reason about that to be like, okay, like we sent Mickey like an SMS, but they didn't respond. But we called him and he did answer. So then the next time, I think I'm going to call him first before I send him a text. Like there's actually some thinking going on there, and the agents can actually reason based on what decisions should be made in that instance is probably the first thing.
Perfect. So I'm toying. I got like 3 questions running around in my head. You mentioned about business process. How important is that side of this when you think about use cases involving the business process, thinking about the business process? How important is that when you're starting to build out the agent? And maybe let me dive a little deeper to say, if I've got this process that I've had in place since 2012, because that's when I started and I like consistency. And so I've held on to it for a very long time. How important is that to leverage an agent looking at this process and maybe even considering to what extent we keep the process in the same steps or rethink it completely based on what an agent can do?
Yeah, I think, well, let's just like talk about, for example, like higher education right now, like we know is facing, like this audience would know better than most around kind of the challenges that the industry is seeing at a whole, like from kind of capacity issues to compliance issues. There are kind of a wealth of challenges. I think what we've seen as a result of that, like working with partners, is we're finding that staff are spending majority of their time kind of doing like operational tasks. Like to your point, like processing documents, answering kind of like routine questions. And I think over time, like the default has been to try different solutions to kind of fix that. Like you might have like workflow automation tools, or like you might create a dashboard to help with that, or like chatbots. I think now that with the evolution of agents, like it is super important to kind of rethink how that process is being done and how an agent can kind of better support that. Because I think over time we have seen workflows being used to drive automation, chatbots, we've seen dashboards, but now it's like, okay, how could that process be more or less kind of done differently? I'll give you one example of that actually, slightly off topic, but I'll bring it back in terms of like, I often see a lot of institutions like processing transcripts, for example. Typically quite a manual process that has been like done the same way for a while now in terms of kind of manual GPA recalculation. If you think about an agent, like an agent can actually very much handle that kind of process for you and allow kind of staff members to actually spend time reviewing the application or kind of talking to the students by obviously like extracting all of that information off the transcript, being able to recalculate it. So I think to answer your question, I think super important to think about the business process. I would often work with partners to encourage them to think about like, how can you do it differently? Or how can you even just like think about what the process is and identify the components that an agent can like very easily do. And therefore you can keep the team member involved in the remaining parts.
So I'm going to add to the answer.
Perfect.
I'm going to extend the answer. So yes to everything you just said, and then to think about how long it took that staff member to do that.
Yeah.
And how long it will take AI to do that, to understand what other value does that mean that we can offer and contribute back to the student? Because we might accelerate that by weeks. What may have taken 2 or 3 weeks for me to get to is now being done potentially in seconds with that review. Even if I still have a human looking at it, the amount of time it takes is now dramatically there. And so having a stack of folders this high of once I've reviewed, now it's this tall and I can knock them out pretty quickly. So, when we think about that process, let's acknowledge that amount of savings and time will be there, and think about what else can we implicate as trickle down changes that need to happen. The worrying about building out automations that keep reminding me that this is hanging out, that's, by the way, because those are done now. What else can we do in terms of communication, or thinking that the next step that a student might take or that a reviewer might take is a week from now or 2 weeks from now? Well, now it's going to be in a day. And so what is the impact of those changes? What is the impact of me potentially getting back 3 hours of time a week, maybe more? What does that change? A lot of times I think institutions have something in their mind. You're going to get all this time back. You can, as you said, spend more time connecting and engaging with students. Well, let's define what that means. When should you be reaching out? Who should you be contacting? Why? Because you've got all this extra time to do. Is it saying, well, you typically only get to communicate with 10 out of 100. Can we do 50 out of 100 now? And how do we know the right 50? Those things are kind of trickle down. And it's not that you have to solve that before you build an agent, but being aware of those types of things and being clearer with what that impact might be will help others as they adopt the agent that you've built and adopt the new flow of work. And just having that extra thought and getting ahead of it rather than waiting until it's a month after it's been deployed and it's working, and you've got this transcript evaluator who's like, I've just been doing X with my time. Let's think a little bit more further down the road with that. Just
100%.
Yes.
Completely agree. And I get super excited when I work with partners who, after we've implemented the agent, realize that now they can be doing, I guess, more of the strategic work, because they're not necessarily focused on kind of if we use transcripts as that example, like the manual kind of transcript processing, they can be doing more of that higher level thinking, which is awesome.
So, I want to skip forward a bit and think about the other end of the spectrum. And it's something that comes up to me quite often, and it should. I don't want to dismiss that. So, as we insert this agent to take over some of that interaction with students, to start taking action on their behalf or per their direction, we're removing some humans to it. So there's some data that's going to be shared potentially through that. How do we handle data privacy? How do we handle FERPA privacy, FERPA concerns from staff? How do we ensure that that's addressed and taken care of appropriately?
Yeah, so I think, as we all know, obviously higher education institutions handle some of the most sensitive data from an industry perspective. You're totally right in terms of student records, financial data, research data. There is a breadth of data that institutions have access to. And I think from a CollegeVine perspective, security is not it is not a checkbox for us. It is a feature of the way in which that our platform has been more or less designed. And I think from our architecture perspective, we employ a zero trust framework, which essentially means zero trust is a security model principle, which you may have heard of, but it's never trust and always verify. So that means that kind of any action that the agent is taking or any action that the information that the agent is going to do needs to be verified and more or less approved.
Okay.
Also, from then like a platform perspective, there is like different permissions in terms of what data does the agent need access to? What data does you as like an admin user of the agent need access to? So it is very much designed within kind of our agent harness from a security perspective.
I was thinking a little bit, as we think about like a transcript evaluation. So there's some data on that we have to be ensures protected and secure, and B, if an agent is going to help review and place information onto like a transcript evaluation, how does that, how do we ensure that it sees and reads Math 101, a grade of C is Math 101 as a C and not Math 201 as a D? Like how do we ensure that what's coming in is accurate? Is there, or do we keep and maintain human oversight on every single one? What does that process typically look like?
Yeah, so I think 2 points I'll make there. So one, from like an actual agent output perspective, like I think one of the parts that we haven't necessarily spoken around with agent is like evals, like or evaluations on more or less like the agent performance. So I think as part of when building agents, one of the core components is to make sure that there are evaluations in place. So you can actually kind of analyze the agent's performance over time. And evaluations may be kind of how well it has extracted the information, but it may also be evaluations in terms of like how well has it performed to your kind of behavior instructions. You could say there's an agent like that reaches out to students and like you want the agent to be kind of super friendly, for example. You can then send an evaluation to see, okay, what was the tone of the like communications that were sent. So I think evals on the agents are like super important to make sure that they are like working and operating within the parameters that you've scoped. The second thing though, around like the human in the loop element, I think any agent that I'm building with an institution, like I always start with, okay, what part of the process do you want the agent to do? And then what part of the process do you want like the team to do? And I think there are like, across every agent, there are always kind of instances where it does make more sense in some cases for the human to actually do that step of the process. So I think we are often like super deliberate in terms of like, when are we defining kind of like handoffs to different team members? Like, what does it look like if things need to be escalated? What does it need to look like when things need to be reviewed? So, and I very much just work with the partner to kind of define what they look like, but we're super deliberate around like, okay, when does it make the most sense for someone to do that?
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Let's think about, AI is evolving quickly. What you're doing today may not be what you're doing tomorrow because it's moving that fast. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not always. So as institutions are thinking about this for themselves right now and for tomorrow, what's one thing that they might be sleeping on right now? Things that they aren't thinking about or aren't doing, aren't working on that they should be or could be?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is actually like the data that institutions have access to. So obviously when we are kind of like building, or I'm building kind of any agent, like the agent relies on access to kind of information or data to kind of complete its actions. And I think there is a like breadth of data available to different institutions. You think of all the data that exists in like CRMs, for example, all of that information has like a wealth of knowledge that I think there is an opportunity to better expose. I think we've heard this firsthand from some of our partners around kind of how they would like to better expose some of that data from like a CRM perspective. And we actually have a new agent capability we've just released actually, which you can think about as like an agent that more or less like sits on top of your CRM. So an agent that will like do all the reporting for you around kind of all your metrics and dashboards. It can kind of run analysis out of the box. And it more or less sits directly inside your CRM to do those actions.
And so it's connected to kind of like using almost like I use Claude a lot. So I'm using that, and I'm basically using an operator like that where I can prompt, ask questions. It sees, has all of that data in there exposed, and can then give me insights, analysis back. Awesome. Thinking about the future, staying in that futuristic tone. Yes, we've changed a lot over the last 12 months, 6 months, 3 months. What do you think we're going to be doing in 6 months? If we look down the road further 6 months, what do we think will be different? What will we be learning and talking about then?
Yeah, good question. I think that is the $1 million question. I think I've been surprised by how much has like evolved and changed, even like when we think back to like the end of last calendar year, like December, January, to where we are now from like a deployment perspective has been astronomical. I think three things I'm probably like most excited about, or I think will become like increasingly important over the next 6 months. The first is actually the agent harness itself. So I spoke a little bit around like that is actually the architecture that the model sits within. And that's where those things around kind of like security, the information that it has access to, how it kind of uses tools, all of that like underlying kind of architecture that sits around the foundational model, I think will drive differentiation in over the next 6 months. I think the second thing is like, I'm interested to see how agents will continue to handle memory. So like obviously agents, as they expand in complexity and capability, the importance around how we will be able to like inject that memory into the prompt and actually into the agent's context will become like super important. Because you think about like all the information the agent is kind of getting, how do you make sure that it has like the right context at kind of runtime? And there's lots of stuff out there at the moment around like context engineering and
Yes.
RLMs, which is super excited. So I'm excited about that. And then the third thing is probably like open claw agents. So this is obviously redefining like how people engage with agents, whether it's through like a UI or whether it's through like texting or emailing the agents. I think I'm interested to see where that will go. So probably three things I'm most excited about to see how the next 6 months will kind of evolve.
Now that you described those all three, I like the third one. I'm really interested to see how we go with that, because some people are going to like to engage through text. Some might want to do it through a phone or a chat. I really am interested to see how we can take this and apply it through all these different channels equally well, especially on the agent side. Yeah, we can have a conversation, but to think about an agent taking an action for me and I'm doing it through a text, it's just an extra step forward. I'm excited to see where we go with that. I couldn't imagine querying my CRM through text.
When you think about how far we've been over the last 6 months, I'm excited to see where we will go in the next 6 months, because I don't think that's not within the realm of possibility. That's for sure.
Amazing. All right, well, let's pause there, and then we'll have to reconvene in 6 months to see what came to fruition, and then we'll look at the next 6 months. Jess, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. You know, I'm so intrigued, and I believe the audience will be too, in terms of just this work that you're doing and how fast it's changing and the impact that it's starting to have with the institutions that have really started to leverage agents. You know, the feedback I get is there's always a little bit of fear. There's always a little bit of, I just don't know what to expect. But then once they see it functioning and functioning well, once we know that that is in place and it's functioning well, we're seeing some really dramatic, might be an exaggerated word, but some really significant returns on that effort. So thank you for all of your work in helping us kind of move our industry forward. It's going to be the cornerstone, I think, of our work in the next decade, maybe, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, decade, some longer amount of time. So, but thank you again for joining us and sharing your story and helping inform us a little bit more about AI and specifically with agents.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.
Perfect. Well, everyone, thank you again for joining us for another episode. Looking forward to having you on to our coming episodes. There's so much great content coming forward. So please stay tuned. Check out the channel. I always say this, dad joke overuse right here, but it's the law. I have to say this. Please like and subscribe. Give us a comment. It helps the algorithms. AI loves it. YouTube loves it. Spotify loves it. So again, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.